This thing on? Welcome to albertnet. Today we'll talk about how to avoid bad movies. We're into our 8th month of shelter in place, and we're running out of movies. We've seen the Oscar nominees and all the films friends have recommended, and it seems we're down to the dregs. It's bad enough wasting all this time watching a bad movie, but we're also spending half an hour researching a movie before we even commit to one. So in this post, I'm going to give you some fresh guidelines on how to dodge bad movies. I'm going to provide a list of 10 critics who should be banned for life and why. And I'm also going to give you some critiques of 5 awful movies that you should avoid that critics nevertheless somehow manage to love. This isn't just to warn you away from these movies, but because it'll help us examine how these highly acclaimed movies can garner such amazing critical acclaim. And finally, I'm going to provide a list of 20 really good movies I've seen in the last few years, just to end on a positive note. Can we just follow the star ratings? It's common practice to vet movies by looking at their Internet Movie Database user ratings and/or Metacritic scores. But I'm only halfway on board with this. I know I can't trust my fellow man because Avengers Infinity War has an average IMDb rating of 8.4. Meanwhile, no fewer than a dozen sequels have been made to The Fast and the Furious, so it's obvious that the unwashed masses are just pushovers. Professionals ought to do better. For many months, I've been choosing movies based largely on Metascore, that being the averaged ratings from supposedly the world's most respected critics. To some degree, this works. I've been warned off some pretty bad movies that looked good on paper, like Everything is Illuminated, which scored only 58 points on Metascore, though the novel on which it's based is fantastic, and Step Brothers, a mere 51 score, despite Rolling Stone naming it the 17th funniest movie of all time. So while Metascores do seem capable of outing bad movies, they're far from totally reliable. I keep sitting through awful movies that have sky-high average scores. Multiple critics will give some film a perfect 100, and it'll not just be meh, but it'll be actually totally lame. So it seems like when a movie, especially a very serious movie, tries really hard but crashes and burns, it's almost guaranteed to be highly praised by critics anyway. Now, I have a theory. I think when the plot and the point of a movie are totally unfathomable, a certain type of highbrow critic will want to rave about it, perhaps hoping to seem far more sophisticated and perceptive than his readership. For example, Last Year in Marienbad, though it's too old to have a Metascore ranking, exemplifies the kind of relentlessly highfalutin movie that gets elite critics all hot and bothered. And yet, it completely sucks. The 2 main characters are annoying and unrealistic. Their romance is completely unconvincing and tedious. The dialogue is maddeningly obtuse. Original? Perhaps. Watchable? I want that 94 minutes of my life back. Now, I fact-checked the length of this movie, and it's a good thing I did, because I'd have guessed it was at least 3 hours long. And yet, critics adored Last Year at Marienbad, or at least pretended to. On my blog, you'll find a link to a little video homage Richard Brody, the sometime New Yorker critic, pays to Last Year at Marienbad. And just watching the footage in his little video was like, oh my God, this all over again. I'm already rebored. And then he's blathering over this footage, just bloviating about the movie. And if you watch that, you'll understand what I'm talking about. This like hyper intellectual, just over the top, highbrow nonsense that so many critics indulge in. Even the mainstream critic Roger Ebert wrote, I kid you not, in his retrospective review of Marienbad, I sipped my coffee and nodded thoughtfully. It wasn't enough that he liked this movie, he wanted us to actually picture him discussing the movie with a fellow intellectual, so we can appreciate how elevated their discourse was. Now, this weirdness can be explained in terms of mimetic theory. In her great book, The Possessed, Elif Baudeman, citing René Girard, the father of mimetic theory, describes it thus. According to Girard, there is in fact no such thing as human autonomy or authenticity. All of the desires that direct our actions in life are learned or imitated from some other, to whom we mistakenly ascribe the autonomy lacking in ourselves. The perceived desire of the other confers prestige on the object, rendering it desirable. For this reason, desire is usually less about its purported object than about the other. It is always metaphysical in that it is less about having than being. Now, stay with me here, because I know that sounded a lot like the highfalutin nonsense that I've just been lambasting, but the purported object in this case is the movie, and the critic is the other. So by asking us to picture him discussing Last Year in Marienbad while sipping his coffee, Ebert is inviting us not so much to contemplate the movie, but to imagine what it's like to be him, to be so smart as to actually understand this utterly cryptic work. It's not so much that the movie, the object, is desirable. The review is about being the kind of moviegoer that can appreciate such a fine, subtle, highly sophisticated film. It doesn't matter that Ebert may be making fun of himself just a bit in his review. It's still a fawning endorsement of a bullshit movie. Now, audiences who go in for these highly praised but inscrutable films are sharing in the illusion that there's something to get, if only you're smart enough. Believing that they got the movie is a matter of cognitive dissonance. I must have liked it because it's such an amazing film for those alive to its brilliance. Once this self-delusion is built, it's hard to tear down. Even when someone cries bullshit and says, that movie was lame, I was totally lost, these fans just feel extra smug and elite, stroking their goatees or bare chins because in the moment they forget they don't actually have goatees, looking down at the naysayer lost in their metaphysical identification with this supreme intellect. Now, this isn't to say that I'm a lowbrow cretin who only enjoys dippy comedies or action movies. As detailed on my blog, and you can find the link in my post, I think my highbrow credentials are in pretty good order. Now, Mick LaSalle, the San Francisco Chronicle movie critic, who has been at it since 1985, strikes me as pretty reliable. In a recent column, he put forth a very useful idea. He wrote, with a bad story, the best you can hope for is a movie that's bad in such an original way that critics, for a time, will insist it's great. Like Last Year at Marienbad. I totally agree. So look, I don't mind if I end up being underwhelmed by a lowbrow comedy like Wet Hot American Summer, even if Rolling Stone called it the 38th funniest movie of the 21st century. If I choose to ignore the 42 Metascore on a movie like that, well, caveat emptor. But when 26 different critics give a movie like There Will Be Blood a perfect 100, and the Metascore is 93, and I find the movie a bit tedious, and its ending unforgivably ill-considered and poorly executed, erasing any meaning that could have been built up over the previous 2 hours and 38 minutes, I get a little pissed. So I've selected 5 highbrow movies with absurdly generous reviews. I'm going to walk you through exactly how they go wrong and how we go wrong watching them. Note, I've not actually watched Wet Hot American Summer. So, little word of warning, my commentary is chock full of spoilers. Because you absolutely should not watch any of these movies, in my opinion, there's nothing really to spoil. So we'll start with Under the Skin from 2014. This has an 80 Metascore. This highly artsy sci-fi movie features Scarlett Johansson as some kind of a space alien who goes around seducing men and luring them to her weird lair where they sink down into some subterranean liquid and dissolve. She has some kind of supervisor who drives a motorcycle. Eventually she goes rogue and tries to have actual sex, which doesn't work out so well, and eventually some asshole lights her on fire. It sounds more exciting than it actually is. In fact, it was god-awful slow. Fortunately, we were streaming it online, so we were able to speed it up. First to 1.25 times the normal speed, then 1.5, and then finally all the way up to twice the normal speed, and its pace was still glacial. The official runtime of the movie is 1 hour and 48 minutes, but even with the second half sped up, it felt like well over 2 hours. And yet, a dozen critics give this movie a perfect score of 100. For example, Donald Clark of the Irish Times raved about it. Did he literally call it perfect? Well, no, and his review does allude to occasional outbreaks of ambiguity and allows that the chain of command between the alien and her biker superiors is a little unclear. Yeah, the biker had nothing to do with anything else in the movie. We just got a lot of footage of some guy driving around on a motorcycle and occasionally dismounting and walking around. So this critic, Calhoun, goes on to say, the drift of the plot is, however, always easy to grasp. Well, duh, because the same damn thing happens over and over again, the repetition being utterly senseless and frankly cruel. Clark concludes, Under the Skin manages to foster empathy with an entity as isolated from human experience as an avalanche or a weather system. Now, he goes on to say, such achievements tend to allow films to be classed as masterpieces. Okay, first of all, if he admires empathy, why does he have none for the innocent people he's recommending this terrible movie to? And second of all, tend to allow films to be classed? What the fuck? How does an achievement allow anything? Who taught this guy how to write a sentence? I suppose I could sequentially rip apart every rave review of Under the Skin, but there's a more important problem to address. Metacritic claims that Anthony Lane of The New Yorker, who happens to be my favorite critic, also gave it a perfect 100. Naturally, I was skeptical. Not all or even most critics give movies a numerical rating, and I've seen before how Metacritic will sometimes assign a really high score to an only somewhat positive review. So I immediately clicked the link to the full New Yorker review. My discovery, Anthony Lane didn't even review this movie. The New Yorker review is from Richard Brody and could not possibly be given a score of 100. Brody writes, the conceit offers immense promise, but goes on to say, it's not a vision or even an idea. It's a premise, and one that's left completely undeveloped. Glazer evokes the idea of strangeness without actually seeing much, showing much, or revealing much. That job goes to the insistent music, which forces a stereotypical eeriness, as in the scores of 50s sci-fi B movies, but without the hysterical exaggeration, without the fun. Brody praises Johansson's acting, but declares that her 2007 movie, The Nanny Diaries, is a much better movie than Under the Skin. The Nanny Diaries has a Metascore of 46, with New Yorker giving it, by Metacritic's reckoning, a mere 40 points. So much for trusting Metacritic on this one. Note that Anthony Lane has written about this Under the Skin movie within a profile of Scarlett Johansson. He's clearly smitten with her and does praise the movie, but it wasn't a review per se and shouldn't earn the movie 100 points. Now, I wouldn't ask you to ignore all these 100-point reviews just because I hated this movie. Many real critics also butchered it. Rex Reed in The Observer praises Johansson's sex appeal, skin, and smile, but laments her, quote, stunning ignorance about how to choose the right roles. Mick LaSalle in the San Francisco Chronicle gets right to the heart of the problem. He writes, Under the Skin can be confused for a movie that hides its meanings when it's really a movie that hides its meaninglessness. He calls BS on the high-minded ambition of the movie and decries its boring repetition, writing, So this is no normal woman. This isn't even a normal homicidal maniac. This is someone on some kind of supernatural harvesting project. This is clear from the very first minutes, and the movie never advances beyond that. Instead, virtually the entire action of the film just repeats the same kind of event. She goes out, looks for a man, etc. As one might imagine, this becomes quite dull, even sleep-inducing, especially considering the movie's overall cast of slow-moving gloom. Metacritic assigns a rating of 50 points out of 100 to LaSalle's review, which I think is really, really generous. My wife and I hated this movie. We should have just shut it off. But when a movie has such a high Metascore, we have sometimes fallen prey to the sunk cost fallacy, thinking we should give a movie the chance to redeem itself. As agonizingly slow as this movie was, even when sped up, we just kept watching until we finally finished and were utterly disappointed, not just in the movie, but in ourselves for having faith in it. So there are two lessons to be gleaned here. First, don't always trust the Metascore. Second, fail fast. If a movie sucks after 30 or 45 minutes, it's most likely going to suck all the way to the final credits, no matter how many critics fawned over it. To be continued. Well, I've clearly run out of time here, or at least you've run out of patience. So check back in a week for the next 4 movies to avoid, the 10 critics I promised I'd warn you about that you should ban for life, and the 20 best movies that I've seen lately. Thanks for watching.